The girl from the sea. I'm an old man now. I have many memories from my youth. Some memories are happy and some are sad. But there is one memory that I will never forget. It was a summer day, and I was a young man. I loved swimming in the sea. The beach was very beautiful that day. The sky was clear, and the sun was warm. The water was cool and perfect for swimming. I walked down to the sea. I took off my clothes and ran into the water. It felt so good. The water was deep, and the waves were big. I loved the feeling of swimming in the sea. I swam for a long time. The sea was calm, and I felt peaceful. But suddenly, I heard something. It was a voice, a very weak voice. It was calling for help. I stopped swimming and listened carefully. I looked around, but I could not see anyone. The voice called again. "Help! Help!" it cried. It was a woman's voice. She was in trouble. I quickly looked around to find her. I looked in every direction. Then I saw her. She was far away, and she was struggling in the water. Her arms were moving, but she was sinking. I knew I had to help. I swam quickly toward her. The waves were big, but I didn't stop. I had to save her. When I reached her, she was weak. She could not swim anymore. I grabbed her and pulled her toward me. She was heavy, but I kept swimming. I had to get her to safety. Her face was pale, and her eyes were closed. I did not know if she was alive. I was scared. I thought about my family and how they would feel if something happened to me. I finally reached the shore. I pulled her out of the water and onto the sand. I checked to see if she was breathing. She wasn't moving. I felt so scared. I tried to keep her warm by covering her with my jacket. I looked around for help. There was no one nearby. I waited and waited. It felt like hours. I didn't know what to do. Then, finally, a group of people came. They had seen us from far away and ran to help. They quickly took her to the hospital. I was very worried. I didn't know if she would be okay. I stayed at the beach, waiting for news. Hours passed. Finally, a nurse came and told me that she was alive. She was still unconscious, but she was breathing. I felt so relieved. I couldn't believe it. I had saved her life. The next day, I went to the hospital to see her. The nurse told me she was still asleep. She didn't remember what happened. She was very weak. I sat beside her bed. I looked at her face. She was beautiful. I felt happy that she was alive, but I also felt sad because she did not know me. Days passed, and she woke up. At first, she didn't know who I was. She looked around and asked, "Where am I?" I smiled and said, "You are safe now. You are in the hospital." She looked at me, confused. She didn't remember the accident or how I saved her. I stayed with her every day. I talked to her and tried to help her remember. She didn't remember much, but she began to feel better. Slowly, she started to trust me. She smiled at me and I felt happy. One day she looked at me and said, "I think I know you. But where am I from?" I was surprised. She had started to remember, but there were still many things she could not remember. As the days went by, she started to remember small things. She remembered her name. It was Emily. She also remembered that she liked to paint. I was happy because she was getting better. But there was still one thing she couldn't remember: her family. One day she asked me, "Do you think my family is looking for me?" I didn't know what to say. "Maybe," I said, "but don't worry. I will help you find them." We talked every day. She asked many questions, and I answered as best as I could. She was always kind and smiled when I spoke. I felt close to her. I wanted to help her find her family. One morning, Emily said, "I remember something. I remember my home." She looked excited, but also nervous. "Where is it?" I asked. She thought for a moment and said, "I think it is near the sea." We travelled to the sea together. It took us many days to reach the coast. Emily was excited but also nervous. She wanted to find her family, but she wasn't sure what we would find. I was with her, and I promised to help her no matter what. When we arrived at the sea, Emily looked around. "I think it's here," she said. She walked along the beach, looking for something familiar. "I can't see anything," she said after a while. I could see the sadness in her eyes. "We will find them, Emily," I said. "You're not alone. I will stay with you." She smiled a little and nodded. We spent many hours walking along the beach, asking people if they had seen anyone who looked like her, but no one knew her. That night we stayed in a small house by the sea. Emily was quiet, thinking. I was tired, but I didn't want to sleep. I wanted to help her. The next morning, Emily said, "I remember something else. I remember my mother. Her face." "Do you remember where she is?" I asked. "No," she said, "but I know she is alive." Her voice was full of hope. I knew we had to keep looking. We couldn't stop now. The next morning, Emily was full of energy. She smiled and said, "Today I will find my family." Her eyes were bright with hope. I could see the excitement in her. I smiled back and said, "Let's keep looking together. We will find them." We walked to the village near the sea. People there knew many things. We asked everyone if they knew Emily's family. Some people said they had seen her parents, but they did not know where they were now. After a long search, we finally met an old woman. She looked at Emily and said, "You look like your mother." "I think I know her." Emily's face lit up. "Where is she? Is she near?" she asked quickly. The old woman nodded. "I saw your mother last year. She lives not far from here. She misses you very much." Emily hugged the woman. Thank you so much," she said, tears in her eyes. We went to the house of Emily's mother. It was not far from the village. When we arrived, Emily knocked on the door. A woman opened the door. She looked at Emily and stopped. Her face turned white. "Mom!" Emily cried. The woman started to cry too. "Emily, my dear Emily, I thought I had lost you forever." They hugged each other for a long time. I smiled, happy to see them together again. Emily and her mother stayed in the house for a long time, talking and crying. They were so happy to be together again. I sat quietly in the corner, smiling. I was glad that Emily found her family. It was a good feeling to see them happy. After a while, Emily turned to me and said, "You saved my life. I will never forget you." She smiled and hugged me. "Thank you for everything." I smiled back and said, "I'm happy I could help you." "You are strong, Emily. You didn't give up." Her mother also smiled at me. "You are a kind man. Thank you for bringing my daughter back to Mem." Days passed, and Emily's memory slowly returned. She remembered her life before the accident. She remembered her parents, her friends, and the happy days at the beach. But she would never forget the man who saved her. Years passed, and Emily grew up to be a strong and kind woman. She and her mother often visited me. We would sit together, talking about the past, the good times, and how we met. Emily was now married and had children of her own. She had a family of her own, just like her mother and father wanted. One day, Emily came to me with her children. They were happy, laughing and playing. She smiled and said, "Thank you for everything, Grandpa. You made my life beautiful." I smiled at her children. "I am happy to see you all, so happy. You remind me of the past, the good times." I closed my eyes and thought about the young woman I saved many years ago. I was glad I was part of her story, and I was happy to see her happy with her family. I knew that, in the end, everything had turned out well.